Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. So before we get started, I think it's important to point out before we begin that we're in Indian country. We are on Wintu land right now. But wherever you go in this big, beautiful valley, this place where I was born, you'll be in Indian country. And even if you go over here to the airport and you get on an airplane and you fly to Argentina and you drive down to the tip of Patagonia, you'll be in Indian country. Same thing if you get on a plane and you fly all the way up to the Yukon Territory and you get on a motorcycle or on skis and you go to the shores of the Arctic Sea, you'll be in Indian country. There's one thing that you remember from our brief time together this evening. I hope it might be that. I also want to say before we get started that this is rugged territory we're going to cover this evening. And you may find yourself overwhelmed by men's inhumanity to man, and by cruelty, and by unspeakable horror. If someone in your row needs to get up and leave, I ask that you just kindly let them go. You might want to just go outside and get a breath of fresh air or say a prayer. And if after a few minutes it's too much, you don't have to come back. My feelings will not be hurt. The ceremony continued until just before dawn. Illuminated by a central fire, the dancers moved together to ancient rhythms. The women's clamshell necklaces, as you see here in this photograph, clicking softly against their seashell dresses. Dancing next to them were men attired in the regalia of deer, foxes, and hunters, supporting the women. These clothes were heavy. Periodically, the singers would stop. They would turn their faces toward the heavens and they would recite the ancient incantations of Nidash, or the feather dance, giving thanks not only for the original creation of this marvelous world that we get to live in, but also for its renewal, its recreation in each and every moment. Finally, the hour grew late, and the dancers walked away from the central council fire, arm in arm, and they made their way into snug redwood houses through round doors. They lay down next to kith and kin and visiting people from neighboring tribes, unaware that just 7 miles away in the town of Crescent City, militiamen were gathering with the intent to destroy them. Crescent City's Coast Rangers and Klamath Mounted Rangers were state militia units that had been heavily armed by the state of California. In the preceding months, they had received dozens of rifles, muskets, and tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition, along with sabers, cutlasses, and bayonets, provided to them by the state of California through donations made by the United States Army in California. In the pre-dawn hours, as the Nidash celebrants slept, Taloa, Yurok, Kuruk, and others, 116 of these militiamen, accompanied by an unknown number of volunteer auxiliaries from the Smith River Valley, slowly encircled the village. They took up positions concealed behind the brows of sand dunes or hidden in the brush or in the shadows of outcroppings of rock. And as the sun rose over the redwood-clad hills of the Coast Range, women, men, and children emerged from those redwood houses to begin their day. And as they did so, said one eyewitness participant later, we shot them down just as fast as we could reload our weapons. That morning, hundreds of people lost their lives. When the screaming and the shooting finally came to an end, only one of the attackers was wounded. The state of California later paid these militiamen for their so-called work. Between the years 1846 and 1873, California's indigenous population plummeted from perhaps 150,000 individuals to not more than 30,000 survivors. Diseases, dislocation, and starvation were important causes of this demographic catastrophe. But this was also more than two civilizations coming into contact for the first time. This was, in fact, a case of genocide. Genocide is a politically loaded, in fact, an explosive term. So I want to explain to you what I mean by this terminology. For a judge in an international court of law to convict a human being of this crime, which some have described as the crime of crimes, the prosecutor in the case must convince the judge and the jury that the defendant has done two things. First, that they have intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. But they also have to commit one of the 5 genocidal crimes enumerated here. Following the formulation of this new international treaty, to which almost every nation in the world is now a signatory, scholars began to reinvestigate and reimagine the conquest and colonization of California. And by the turn of the century that we live in now, by the year 2000, over 20 different scholars had determined that what happened here in California did indeed constitute genocide. I'll stay away from that speaker. So why did I pour 10 years of my life into writing this book if there were already so many important sociologists, anthropologists, and historians who had made this conclusion? Why? Because as I began to speak to California Indian communities in my research project, I began to learn just what was at stake. So the topic of genocide, wherever it happens in the human experience, calls for meticulous research and analysis. In this particular case, the stakes are incredibly high, not only for scholars like myself who have the privilege of working at a university, but for California Indian people and for everyone who chooses to make a life in the United States. If United States citizens colonize some regions of California, if not the state as a whole, based upon the systematic and intentional physical annihilation of indigenous people, scholars need to reevaluate some of the fundamental axioms that today guide our understanding of California history. For example, scholars could revisit the assumption that they have that it was diseases, that is, the passive process of colonization, rather than active policies like state-sponsored mass murder, that were the leading causes of death and ultimately of this massive population catastrophe. Exceptionalist interpretations of United States history, that is the idea that the history of the United States is somehow fundamentally different from the histories of all other nations on Earth, come into question if we begin to compare, for example, the genocide that took place here in California with other genocides during the colonization process in other parts of the world. And I'm thinking of places like Africa or the Middle East or Australia. Where scholars documented genocide, it then becomes very important to work down into the details, to figure out what happened to particular indigenous nations, to families, and to individuals. It also then becomes a question of whether a phenomenon like genocide in California is part of a larger national or continental or even hemispheric pattern of killing. What tends to catalyze genocide? Who ordered the killing? Who paid for it? Who bloodied their hands taking the lives of children, women, and men? The genocide question is particularly urgent for California's Indian peoples. There are approximately 150,000 California Indian people today, 109 federally recognized tribes, and scores of others that are not recognized by Washington. Should they press for reparations, apologies, or control of land where genocidal events took place? Will tribes be able to marshal evidence of genocide in state and federal court cases involving their sovereignty? How should they commemorate the victims of mass murder while at the same time emphasizing their survival, their accommodation, and their current cultural and political renaissance? The psychological issues related to genocide are also fraught. What happens, for example, when a tribal citizen learns that she or he is the descendant not only of genocide survivors, but also of genocide perpetrators? How might California Indian nations, families, and individuals reconcile an increased knowledge of the role that the federal government played in this mass killing with the extraordinarily high rates of volunteer participation in the United States Armed Forces? Finally, what role might genocide, acknowledgement, apology, reparations, and teaching have on the widespread intergenerational historical trauma so prevalent in California Indian communities, and that intergenerational historical trauma's direct links to widespread health problems in Indian country, and, perhaps most pressing, the highest rate of youth suicide in the state of California. But the question of genocide is not only one that is important to municipal, county, state, and federal officials and California Indian people and their nations. It is also a question that directly impacts everyone who makes a life here in the United States. Should federal officials tender public apologies, as did Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush for the World War II era internment of almost 90,000 Japanese Americans, many of them citizens of the state of California? Should federal officials offer compensation along the lines of the more than $1.6 billion that Congress has now given to Japanese American internees and their descendants? Might California officials decrease their cut of California Indians' $7.3 billion a year in gaming revenues? Those are 2014 numbers, as a way of paying reparations for the state of California's involvement in driving the killing process. A better understanding of the genocide that happened here in California might also impact the federal government's dealings with the scores of California Indian communities, some of whom you've heard from this evening, who are seeking federal recognition, or re-recognition, I should say. The question of commemoration is closely linked. Will the state of California and its citizens support or even tolerate the same kinds of state-sponsored days of remembrance that today commemorate the Holocaust of European Jewry or the Armenian genocide? With the same kinds of monuments, museums, and state-sponsored days of remembrance? Will genocide against California Indian peoples join these mass murders in our state's public school standards for curricula? What about public discourse? These are all extraordinarily important questions, but they can only be addressed in very, very limited ways without understanding the mass murder process that dominated the California Indian experience between 1846 and 1873. Now, sporadic mass murder punctuated the colonial experience in California before the gold rush. But it was really James Marshall's 1848 gold strike that precipitated a dramatic increase in incidents of killing. And it was particularly miners like this gentleman pictured here who came south from Oregon to mine. These men had no connection to colonial California and to the deep weaving together of Mexican and California Indian peoples, and they largely saw the indigenous people of California as a dangerous obstacle in the way of their path toward the rapid acquisition of gold. In 1849, Oregonians' attacks on California Indians dramatically increased, not only in the number of massacres that they committed, but also in their very lethality, particularly in the central mines, which we see here, which is where the gold rush was first booming. One 49er explained in a diary entry that I found, and I quote, "Oregon people had been used to shooting Indians, and in California, they did shoot them freely." That April, a miner named Theodore Johnson entered the epicenter of this local genocide near Coloma, right where Marshall had first found gold. In his journal, he recounted multiple massacres, homicides, the beheading of California Indian people, and the taking of California Indian people's scalps. There were no newspapers yet in the central mines at this point. So due to spotty primary source coverage, we will never know the precise number of lives lost during these periods. But we do know that between late 1849 and early 1850, hundreds and perhaps thousands of California Indian people suffered violent deaths in the central mines. What was clear to the observers at the time was the genocidal intent of the killers. They spoke of clearing the land of Indians completely, and its impact. Many of these zones did become cleared out of their indigenous peoples. In December of 1849, Pomo and Wapo people living here at Kelsey, what is now Kelseyville, on the shores of Clear Lake, rose up against two men, Stone and Kelsey, who were holding them as slaves. In response to this double homicide, vigilantes and regular United States Army soldiers killed at least 1,000 or more California Indian people between Christmas Day of 1849 and May 15th, 1850. Vigilantes first murdered and massacred large numbers of indigenous farm workers and cattle ranchers in what are now the Napa and Sonoma valleys. And an interesting thing happened here. A counter group of vigilantes rose up, a bigger group, and they arrested these 8 vigilantes and they brought them down to Benicia, where they were held as prisoners on a US Navy ship. The state of California was just getting itself organized at this point, and so the case of these 8 vigilante Indian killers became the very first case to come before our brand new state Supreme Court. But an odd thing happened. The state Supreme Court justices determined that they could not safely hold these men, and so they let all 8 of them go on bail, and the men were never formally tried. Meanwhile, the United States Army began a major anti-Indian hunting campaign involving elements of infantry, United States cavalry, and also regular United States artillery. They moved in a broad arc up to Clear Lake, killing as they went. And when they reached the northern shores of Clear Lake, something terrible happened. In a San Francisco newspaper article titled "Horrible Slaughter of Indians," a journalist described a massacre committed on an island in the northern portion of the lake, using information provided directly to him by a regular United States Army captain. And I quote, "Little or no resistance was encountered, and the work of butchery was of but short duration. Neither age nor sex were spared. It was the order of extermination, fearfully obeyed. As many as 800 Pomo and Wapo people, almost all women and children, were shot, bayoneted to death, drowned, or beaten to death with the oars of rowboats that morning." Other killings followed. The operation now swung down through the Russian River Valley, killing as they went, burning villages to the ground, and lynching people that they found. A new factor was at work. Large-scale, extended Indian killing operations by vigilantes and by the United States Army, tolerated and supported by both federal and state authorities. All of the officers involved in that US Army operation received promotion. One of them, George Stoneman, later became a full United States Army general and the governor of this state. Another one of them became a major general in the United States Army. One of them rose so high that he was in charge of all military operations in the territory of Arizona. As the gold rush continued, newcomers surged into the state. Before the gold rush, there were perhaps 12 to 14,000 non-Indian people living in the entire area of what we now think of as California. But as you can see from this graph, by 1860, that number had surged to over 360,000. Now, these newcomers came to California not with the intention of killing Indians. That was not their main goal. Most of them came here, we know from their journals and their letters home, to get rich and to get rich quickly by mining gold from the streams, rivers, and hills of Northern California. But in seeking to feed themselves, clothe themselves, acquire labor, and satisfy their rapacious sexual desires, they placed intense pressures on California Indian communities. These desires generated not only the environmental catastrophe that was the California gold rush, but also large-scale industrialized hunting that wiped out entire species, like the California grizzly bear. Also large-scale timbering operations that cut down with catastrophic consequences one of the cornerstones of California Indian traditional foods, which was the oak tree, bearing nutritious, high-calorie acorns. In addition, people sought labor, and they made it unfree through various forms of servitude. California's new leaders magnified the impact of immigration. United States military officers who were in charge of California Indian policy here between 1846 and 1849 passed a series of martial laws that made California Indian people into non-citizens with very few, if any, rights. For example, California Indian people had to have a pass in order to travel from place to place. If they did not have such a pass, they could be arrested and subject to work on a chain gang in places like San Francisco and Monterey and Los Angeles. But it was really California's 1849 Constitution, our state's first constitution, debated and written here in Colton Hall, a building in Monterey that you can still visit even today, that made it very, very difficult for California Indian people to vote, almost impossible, and which determined that California Indian people would not be citizens in the new state. A few months later, California's first state legislature met in 1850, and one of the very first acts that they passed determined that California Indian people under no circumstances could vote. They determined that in almost all civil and criminal cases, Indian people could not serve as witnesses for or against whites. They also determined that California Indians, being non-voters, would also not be able to serve as jurors. They later determined that California Indian people could not serve as lawyers or as judges. In fact, it was not until the year 1971 that the first California Indian person, a Karuk man, was admitted to the bar in California to practice law here. What all of these laws did in toto, when we add them up, was to exclude indigenous people both from participation in and protection by the new state's legal system. One consequence was widespread abduction of California Indian people, and this systematic abduction up and down the state played a crucial role in this catastrophe. In 1850, legislators passed what they called an Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which legalized white custody of Indian minors as well as prisoner leasing. What this led to were actual slave auctions. Local law enforcement officials who arrested Indian people were required by law to then auction them off on Monday mornings to the best bidder for the price plus a fee of the fine for the misdemeanor of which the California Indian person had been convicted. So what this led to is a legal system in which California Indians could be forced into unpaid work for extended periods of time based upon trumped-up charges. Because remember, they were not allowed to testify in court against whites. So they were not allowed to defend themselves to explain, this person is making a false accusation. 10 years later, the state legislature decided to expand this law, legalizing the indenture of any Indian, man, woman, or child. This new law intensified the genocidal impact of slave raiding. So if everyone will stand up for a moment, if you just stand up just for a moment. If you're asleep, go ahead and you don't have to stand up. So the first thing that would happen, imagine that we are all in the same village. We're sharing this evening together, but imagine we share our lives and every one of us in this room is related to each other. The first thing that happens is everybody who's my age and older, who's a man, it's over. So you can all sit down. Any man who's over 30, you can sit down. It's over for you. And now, any woman who's over 30. So that's the first wave of what this means. The next thing that happens is that those of you who are left standing, you're going to be taken away, tied up in lines of human beings, led away behind mules, and taken away to the places where people were sold, bought and sold. And then people were often worked to death. So everyone else can now sit down. But the other ramification of this that is crucial to understand is that when people got to the slave markets, they would be separated and separated forever unless they ran away and were able to reach their home. That meant that women and men of biological reproductive age could not reproduce the community. That meant that people who grew up in the homes of non-Indians did not learn their language. They could not learn their religion. They could not know who they really were. The process had dire demographic consequences. In Los Angeles, where I live now, a famous prosecutor from the 1850s in his memoirs wrote, Los Angeles had its weekly Monday slave mart, and thousands of honest, good, absolutely useful people were destroyed in this way. And when I first read his memoir, I thought that this must be exaggeration, this must be hyperbole. But the documents collected by the US Office of the Census support this. Between 1850 and 1860, Los Angeles's Indian population plummeted. Between 1850 and 1870, it plummeted from 3,619 individuals to just over 200. Escape was a way, as I said before, that California Indian people defied servitude, and often successfully. But whites often responded to escape from slavery with overwhelming lethal force. The Lasik Wailaki woman, Lucy Young, who we see in portrait in her later years here, she recollected, and I quote, "Young woman been stole by white people, come back, shot through lights and liver. Front skin hang down like apron. She tie up with cotton dress, never die neither." Others were less fortunate. After one California Indian woman fled her, quote, "lord and master with his Indian boy" in 1858, whites massacred an entire village of some 15 people, just east of the Sacramento. 2 years later, a rancher on the Van Dusen River became so incensed when his 7-year-old Indian servant went a mile away to visit his family that he, quote, slaughtered the whole family, 6 persons, boy and all. The last 2 descriptions that I gave you are not from Lucy Young's memoirs, but rather from very public California newspaper accounts that were published repeatedly by a variety of different California newspapers. Federal officials knew that this was happening, but they explicitly refused to intervene. In fact, then Secretary of War Jefferson C. Davis, who would later become President of the Confederacy, told California military officials that Indian slave raiding in California should be a state matter and a matter for the posse comitatus, not the U.S. Army. The United States Congress, meanwhile, made California Indian people particularly susceptible to the blast of immigration. Between 1851 and 1852, the 3 treaty negotiators who you see pictured here with California Indian diplomats negotiated 18 separate treaties with 119 California Indian tribes in which they agreed to set aside the gray areas that you see here inside the white areas. This is approximately 7.5% of the total land area of the state of California, and it's approximately 7,488,000 acres. But when these 18 treaties became public, California politicians from the governor to assemblymen and senators turned against them, and they exerted strong pressure on California's congressional delegation not to pass them. And they sent letters and they lobbied. And so the United States Senate met in a closed session, the exact proceeds of which we don't know, but they decided to repudiate these treaties and to sign none of them. The treaties then languished in a basement file until the 20th century, when they were again made public. Instead of these large reservations, Congress decided to authorize just 5 temporary military reservations not to exceed 25,000 acres each. So we go from a situation in which the United States has promised California Indian tribal leaders and diplomats that will receive roughly 7.5 million acres, and in this new situation, they are not to receive any more than 125,000 acres. But there were also important consequences. First, no reservations were patented. And what that meant was that jurisdiction over those temporary military reservations was uncertain. The result was a struggle between state and federal authorities over who actually could run the reservations and who had authority there. The second thing that happened was the consequence of that. That was confusion and conflict, and that neither the state nor the federal government took responsibility for the dire conditions that developed on reservations in California. Third, and this is very important, California Indian people did not become the explicit wards of the federal government. In the treaties, it was quite clear that California Indian communities who were signatories would receive the protection of the federal government. Without those treaties, they did not receive that protection. Finally, some years later in 1857, Major General John Wool, who is the commander in charge of the Department of the Pacific, which included the state of California, explicitly ordered all of the officers under his command, that is, every U.S. military officer on land in the state of California, that until these reservations are perfected, the United States troops have no right either to exclude whites from entering and occupying these reserves or to prevent them from taking Indian people, including women and children. So the denial of the reservations by the United States Senate made California Indian people vulnerable not only to kidnapping and slavery, but also to assault, theft, homicide, and massacres. But it was really the establishment of California's new militia system that marked the rise of a state-sponsored killing machine in California. Between the years 1850 and 1861, 3,414 California men voluntarily joined 24 separate state militia expeditions against California Indian people. And these expeditions took place as far north as what is now Modoc County, right hard by the Oregon border, and they took place to the south, as far south as the Colorado River Valley that separates Arizona from California today. These operations killed at an absolute minimum 1,342 California Indian people. But it's important to understand that their impact it was so much bigger than just these numbers. Why? Because these state-sponsored militia expeditions were a very public message. They told everyone living in California, not only can you kill California Indian people, children, women, men, with absolute impunity, no fear of being arrested, but in fact, you'll be richly rewarded for doing so. The result of that message was widespread vigilantism. Sometimes vigilantes raised money from California communities, as they did in Red Bluff and in Shasta and in other places near where we are tonight. But sometimes they just raised a group on their own and set off killing Indian people. And so in total during these years, vigilantes killed an absolute minimum of 6,400 California Indians. And it is very difficult to find a case in which a white man suffers any legal consequences in this state's judiciary system for violence against California Indian people during these years. Intent to destroy California Indian people was only very thinly camouflaged at the top. In January of 1851, this man, our state's first democratically elected civilian governor under United States rule, Peter Burnett, declared, this is a public declaration, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct. Soon thereafter, the very next month, legislators put the power of the purse behind Burnett's words. They decided to take out a $500,000 loan to fund past and future California Indian hunting expeditions. This would, in that year, be the single largest line item in the state of California's budget. Meanwhile, the state built an arsenal in San Francisco where they began stockpiling many, many weapons, cannons, rifles, shotguns, pistols, musketoons, sabers, bayonets, swords, saddles, all kinds of accoutrements, all donated to the state of California by the United States Army. By 1852, United States Senator John Weller, who would later become governor of the state of California in 1858, told his fellow United States senators in Washington, D.C., that California Indians will be exterminated. And he insisted, the interest of the white man demands their extermination. That same year, having already spent the first $500,000 that they had raised before, California legislators raised another $600,000 to fund additional state militia operations against California Indians. And once again, it was the single largest line item in the entire state budget for the year. The Sinkyone woman, Sally Bell, we see her in a portrait near the end of her life, provides us with a rare California Indian eyewitness account of a massacre that took place sometime in the mid-1850s. Bell remembered, and I quote, About 10 o'clock in the morning, some white men came. They killed my grandfather and my mother and my father. I saw them do it. Then they killed my baby sister, and they cut her heart out, and they threw it into the brush where I had run and hid. My little sister was just a baby, just crawling around. I did not know what to do. I was so scared, I guess I just hid there a long, long time with my little sister's heart clutched in my hands. It was a terrifying time to be a California Indian person. The United States Congress endorsed such killing, even as state and federal leaders perfected the killing machine. We would be looking here at an image of William C. Kibbe, who is the Adjutant General of the state of California, and who went so far as to publish and distribute to every one of his officers a tactical manual on light infantry tactics and light cavalry tactics in order to improve their Indian hunting capabilities. Meanwhile, in 1854, the United States Congress decided to give the state of California $924,000 to reimburse the state for its expenses in militia campaigns against California Indian people. And the next year, William C. Kibbe had this to say in his annual report to the state: "There are but two alternatives before us, viz. either to wage a war of extermination or to entirely give up a large and productive territory." Meanwhile, Secretary of War Jefferson C. Davis sent Kibbe a Christmas present: crates full of United States Army light infantry tactical manuals to distribute to his militia officers. Then in 1857, having now already spent $1.1 million, this is in the 1850s, it's a vast amount of money, on Indian hunting expeditions, state legislators appropriated an additional $410,000 for more operations. And in 1861, even as the Union is being torn apart by secession, the beginnings of what will be the U.S. Civil War, Congress decided to appropriate another $400,000 to help the state of California pay for Indian hunting expenses. But civilians and officials, while the killing was going on, also carried out large-scale forced removal operations intended to force California Indian populations onto some of those temporary military reservations. And these operations were often lethal. For example, in 1856, a group of vigilantes seeking to force a group of people to go to the Mendocino Reservation near the coast killed 56 people in the process. The Lake Yakuts woman Yoemut recollected that when her people were forcibly removed to the Fresno Reservation, vigilantes first killed a dozen people and then shot 10 more along the way. Likewise, the Nome Lackey man Andrew Freeman explained in his memoirs that when they took the Indians to the Round Valley Reservation, they drove them like stock. They shot the old people who were too weak to make the trip. They would shoot children for getting tired. Once at those temporary military reservations, California Indian survivors of those marches and those roundups faced malnutrition and sometimes outright starvation. We're looking here at the distribution of rations day at Mendocino Reservation. The Concow leader Tomayanem recollected that when his people reached this place, we were often very hungry, and the Concows began to die very fast. And so he led his people south to the Round Valley Reservation, but there he recollected there was even less to eat. And the records prove him right. In the year 1860, the Office of Indian Affairs officials at the Round Valley Reservation provided people typically with 480 to 910 calories per day, but then only if they were able to work. If you were not well, or you could not work for some reason, you received no rations. But then the United States Congress decided that since the California Indian population was plummeting, they did not need to spend so much on it. So they cut the congressional appropriations for California Indian people. The consequence was that by 1862, the daily rations at Round Valley had fallen to just 380 to 190 calories per person per day. And again, you only received those minimal rations if you were able to work. So if some California Indian people interned at these reservations died of absolute starvation, and they did, many others suffered a kind of chronic malnutrition, day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out. And we know that a limited diet has dire consequences for a human being's immune system and its ability not only to fight off initial infection by pathogens, but then to recover from that infection. Moreover, the lack of nutrition diminished the fecundity of women. It led to increased stillbirths, to sterility, and the inability of women to lactate and feed their newborn children. In addition, some reservation officials and colonists at those reservations used California reservation Indians as disposable labor with dire consequences. According to one colonist testifying under oath at Round Valley, about 300 died on the reservation during the winter of 1857 to 1858 from the effects of packing them through the mountains in the snow and mud. They generally worked naked and packed 50 pounds each if they were able. At California's reservations, willful neglect took an untold number of lives. But federal employees also killed large numbers of people far more directly. During the United States Civil War, 15,725 men voluntarily joined the Union Army, but relatively few of them ever saw combat against the Confederacy. In fact, most of them found themselves deployed here in California. And so militias gave way to federal army operations. And so during the Civil War, the genocide became primarily a federal project. Often operations were led by seasoned officers like this man, a professional soldier. Whereas militia operations had been limited by the state's relatively limited budgets during the Civil War, these operations had far more manpower, far more firepower, and because they were fully backed directly by the federal government, they could stay in the field not for months at a time, but for years and years and years. And United States forces in California killed large numbers of California Indian people during the war years. The very first operation that they carried out here in Northwest California near the coast in 1862 killed approximately 120 people in just 2 weeks, and hundreds more would die. Sometimes reading through the records, they proclaim their killings. A U.S. cavalry captain named Moses McLaughlin proudly reported how in the year 1863, near what is now Bakersfield, I had all the bucks collected together, and 35 were either shot or sabred to death. He concluded, they will soon all be killed off or driven so far into the surrounding lands that they shall perish by absolute famine. The United States Army continued hunting California Indian people not only through the entirety of the war, but long thereafter. And even after officers concluded their last large-scale U.S. Army Indian hunting operation, the infamous 1872-1873 Modoc War. They hanged and beheaded 4 Modoc leaders before shipping their severed heads to a collection in Washington, D.C. In sum, the California Indian catastrophe of these years quite neatly fits the 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention definition. First, perpetrators demonstrated not only in word, but also in deed, their intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Second, they committed not one, but all 5 of the genocidal crimes enumerated here. Killing members of the group occurred in at least 370 separate massacres up and down the state, as well as hundreds of smaller killings, homicides, and state executions. By my calculation, sources indicate that between 1846 and 1873, vigilantes, militiamen, and soldiers killed at least 9,492 to 16,094 California Indian people. These are direct killings, beheadings, shootings, hangings, and the like. These do not include the thousands of people who died at reservations from overwork, exposure, starvation, or the many thousands of others who died of exposure and thirst and starvation as they tried to escape to the high alpine areas or deep into the deserts of this state. By way of contrast, California Indian people killed fewer than 1,400 non-Indians during this entire period. But other acts of genocide proliferated too. Many rapes and beatings occurred, and these meet the convention's definition of causing serious bodily harm to victims on the basis of their group identity and with the intent to physically destroy the group. The sustained military and civilian policy of pushing survivors into those inhospitable deserts and alpine regions also amounted to creating conditions of life intended to destroy the group. Some Office of Indian Affairs officials running those temporary military reservations seem to have been guilty of a similar crime. Further, because malnutrition and exposure predictably lower life expectancy and make it very difficult for people to biologically reproduce, some policymakers at both the state and the federal level appear guilty of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Finally, U.S. Army soldiers, state militiamen, vigilantes, and professional private slave raiders were all involved in the forcible removal of indigenous children from their homes. And scholars estimate that at least 4,000 California Indian youth suffered such forced transfers during these years. Sufficient evidence thus exists to designate the California Indian experience between 1846 and 1873 one of genocide. How do we apportion blame thinking about something so huge? Elected California officials were the primary architects of annihilation. Our state legislators created a legal environment in which the indigenous people of this state had almost no rights, thus granting those who attacked them almost total legal impunity. Moreover, 2 different governors boldly threatened annihilation, and publicly, and both state officials and federal officials spent a great deal of energy building what amounted to a killing machine. Governors called out 24 separate militia expeditions, and the state legislature in both houses repeatedly voted, and by overwhelming votes, to fund it magnanimously. But they could not have done all of this without federal support. The U.S. Army played a crucial role in the California genocide, first creating the initial exclusionary legal system, then setting genocidal precedents with the many massacres they carried out under martial law. They helped to build the killing machine by providing the weapons. They then participated in the killing, and during the Civil War, they took over the process entirely. And in total, U.S. Army soldiers here in California killed at least 1,688 to 3,741 California Indian people. And those are very conservative estimates. But if state legislators were the primary architects, then the federal government helped to lay the groundwork, ultimately became the final arbiters of the design, and finally paid for most of the killing's official execution. Like California Indian people, Native Americans across the United States suffered cataclysmic population declines following the arrival of newcomers. Before contact, there were, by very conservative estimate, at least 5 million Native American people living in what are now the continental 48 states. But by the year 1900, that number had plummeted to just over 250,000 people. What caused this catastrophe? We're taught in school that it's primarily disease, followed by colonialism and war. But I think we have to ask a question. Was something more sinister also at work? Academics and others have long debated whether or not American Indian peoples as a whole, or some particular tribes or bands, were the victims of genocide. Now, there are two factors that polarize this debate. The first is a debate over what the definition of genocide is. But I think we have one already. We have the 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention, which almost every country in the world has signed, and which has now been used in a wide variety of courts, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia. But the other question is, what time span are we talking about, and what amount of land are we talking about? Some scholars insist on speaking about whether or not genocide happened from first contact with Leif Erikson all the way to this very moment that we're sitting in right here together, and from the tip of Patagonia to the shores of the Arctic. What I think may be helpful about this study that I've just presented to you is the idea of taking a very close look at a specific place at a specific time. The direct and deliberate killing of California Indian people between 1846 and 1873 seems to have been the most lethal and sustained anywhere in the United States or its colonial antecedents. But there remains a pressing need for detailed studies of other times and places in United States history. The variables that I've described to you that pertain to California may not pertain to every place and time. But the UN Genocide Convention does provide us with an internationally recognized yardstick for talking about this very painful, very difficult, emotionally charged subject. Native American people responded to and reacted to and experienced colonialism in a wide variety of ways, rigorously examining this range of cases, utilizing the Genocide Convention as a consistent rubric of analysis, can allow us to think more clearly about this topic. Unbraiding each region's story from the tapestry of American Indian history and bringing each into sharper relief will, I hope, create a clearer, more vivid portrait of Native American experiences and the history of the Western Hemisphere as a whole. Such investigations will be painful, but they may help all Americans, both Indian and non-Indian, to make more accurate sense of our past and ourselves. Thank you. I'd particularly like to thank Chris Rodriguez, Denny Mills, Judy Flores, Ava Jimenez, April Carmelo, Jonathan Freeman, Ken Waugh Kravitz, Chairman Rickard for his kind words, Chairman of the Wintu Tribe of Northern California, Elizabeth Wilson, Kayleen Sisk, who kindly offered a beautiful prayer for us, chief of the Winnemem Wintu tribe. Thank you.